and thanks for having me. My pleasure here. Um, my name is Moritz Zimmermann, and I am an entrepreneur in the e-commerce space turned investor. And I'm not sure if this thing works here. Let's see. Oh, there you go. Oh, it does work. Perfect. So it feels like all of my professional life I've been doing not much else but e-commerce software, to be more clear. I've started in '97, in the early innings of e-commerce. There was no Amazon and no Google and certainly no smartphones. And with my team, together we built over 4 generations of e-commerce platforms along the way, including Hybris, which is the company that I co-founded. I think still doing over 500 billion in GMV through its e-commerce and installations out there. We exited that to SAP, and that's how I ended up over there. For a couple of years, I was the CTO of SAP's customer experience division. And now I am a VC, an investor, funding the next generation of disruptive to build round of unicorns in the next couple of years. And today, I want to give you a perspective from an investor side, maybe a slightly different one than usual, but really as an investor, it's actually a very interesting time to be looking at e-commerce software because a completely new generation of e-commerce software is needed. That's our hypothesis as a VC firm. And I'll explain to you what's going on in this industry. And some of the things might be a recap. We've seen them already in the previous presentations, but maybe with a slightly different angle. The first one, and we've seen that before, the monolith is being replaced by the swarm. This is really a pattern that happens across all of enterprise software, all of software probably. Yeah? So it's not just particular for e-commerce. Really, we see this everywhere. And it's really surprising how granular things have become. Nowadays, you can buy literally single features, sometimes even as successful software companies. My mental model is that every Linux service will ultimately become its own company, obviously in the cloud and reinvented in a new form, but sort of like as a mental model, that helps. So where there was one big thing, now there's very many small ones, and they become more and more and more across all types of software categories. SaaS simply enables that. And you can see this here. This is data from Okta. And they obviously, as a single sign-on solution, are connected to many applications, so they are in a good position to count. And you can see the most recent ones from last year, 2020, how this has evolved in red, from just 3 years ago. The numbers are up and sometimes up to 50%. And that will, I think, continue. Obviously, some industries are leading, some are following, but overall, that trend is definitely happening. And I'm very much convinced that it will continue because obviously flexibility is good and specialization is good. That's what drives sort of like capitalism in the industry. And it's gotten a lot easier through APIs and APIs layered on top of other APIs. It's gotten a lot easier through SaaS because you can now actually concentrate on just one thing that you're really good at as a company, and you can then scale that easily globally. And that's really a massive trend that we're seeing. And obviously, if you look at those famous vendor landscapes, you've probably seen many of them. There's now over 8,000 just in the e-commerce MarTech space. If you go back maybe 5-6 years, you could maybe still start counting the logos. I think now, if you look at this, even with a magnifying glass, it's a futile effort. And I'm telling you, it's going to be more. Next year, there will be another one, and it will probably be 12,000. And, we're going to cross the 20,000 soon, and it will not stop. I don't see the trend reversing in any meaningful way. And so that's a reality. On the one hand side, that could be good, because, you have more choice, more options. On the other hand, it also has a bit of an element of potentially being overwhelming. How do you actually make sense of all this? How do you make it work? And especially when sort of like you need all these components somehow. And, we talked a little bit about SaaS and cloud being catalysts for this transformation, for this trend. But there's also another trend which I think is very important, particularly for e-commerce. And e-commerce is a fast-moving industry. Things change very quickly. There's another, other industry or pastime more that's also fast-moving. And I don't know if you watched it, but the final of the Formula One season was coming up last weekend. And it was literally a photo finish between Max Verstappen and sorry, now the guy escapes me, huh? That's how quickly it goes, You're number two. Nobody cares about you anymore when you're number two. Hamilton, of course. Yeah, now we got him again. Last round, finally, Verstappen made it and won the season. And obviously, in order to win Formula One, certainly the most important thing that you need to have is speed. If your car goes faster than the other cars, well, then whether that's due to better tires, I think in this case, or a better engine or whatever, you win. And if you take this analogy to e-commerce, there's probably one company that everybody in a way looks up to as a role model, a company that's being cited in hundreds of companies, public quarterly reports. Some of them are really afraid of them. Some of them are making good money with it. And you've probably guessed it, that company is Amazon. So the player that probably has the highest speed in the industry and evolved that capability is Amazon. Amazon has started probably around a decade ago to develop a capability where they can roll out new things, software side, in a very, very rapid way, and then iterate and test. And just to put things into perspective, if you look at how many software deployments, you would typically do in a calendar year. If I look back, some of my customers were saying, well, we deploy every 2 months onto our e-commerce platform. Some would say, well, we are better than this. We deploy once a month. Maybe others say, oh, we're even better. We do bi-weekly sprints, and then we deploy every 2 weeks. All fine and good. But anybody have an idea how many deployments to Amazon.com these guys are doing? Would it be 100? Would it be 1,000? No, the number is much, much higher. It's 54 million deployments in a calendar year. So if you break that down, 365 days, 24 hours, 60 seconds, whatever, then it's literally almost a deployment every second. Not the same team, sort of like deploying every second, but it's many, many teams working in parallel and doing that. And that is what speed is about. And that capability, has allowed Amazon to roll out new things and very quickly iterate them and make them good so that customers really want them. Because quite often it's also that you are charting an uncertain path. You don't know exactly how the product needs to look like, how the offer needs to look like, and you need to iterate. That's the agile method. And that is something that is enabled through this split of the monolith into a lot of small services, because every small service, every small fish can actually be managed by a separate team and can innovate on their own and deploy on their own. That's how this works. And we've just seen sort of like through 2 years of pandemic, how this agility, rewards companies that have it and punishes those that don't. Because suddenly, you might not have stores that are open because they're locked down. You might have to think about new business processes, maybe like a pickup on the curbside, or you might have to. I've had customers that were launching a B2B initiative and said, no, we have to go B2C now because our stores can't work, or our channel partners, are closed. We have to find other ways for consumers to find us. And so that's really, putting it to the extreme of why agility is needed. So that's a big driver. Now, assuming all these trends are happening, you could argue, well, what about the legacy players? There's a bunch of companies. I co-founded one, but there's others, that have been around for quite some time. You could argue, like, if I've been doing e-commerce for 25 years, it must be pretty much a mature industry. Yes, it's true, but I think the existing incumbent players, they are struggling to keep up with that. It's almost like having to fix engines on an airplane mid-flight. And that's a very, very tough thing to do. And they have to do a number of things in parallel. They have to, for example, many of them, not all of them, but many of them have to move away from single tenancy. Many of these architectures are still stemming from the early 2000s, are still stemming from a single tenant approach that was originally designed to be deployed on premise in a customer's data center. And that moved maybe to a hyperscaler now, but it's still the single tenant legacy there. And let me explain a little bit why that might be a problem with single tenancy. There's a high burden on the customer running the system, on the testing side, on the customization side, to make sure that when every new release comes, everything still works. And so sometimes these costs amount to six figures. Then if you have multiple releases a year, well, you can do the math. It quickly gets very, very expensive. So expensive that some customers then say, wait a minute, we don't want that, we cannot afford that, we're not going to upgrade. So we're just going to stay on what we are for the next 2 years. Well, that also then cuts you off from the future innovation that the vendor produces on their product roadmap. Also probably not such an attractive approach. And multi-tenancy or single tenancy is sometimes really deeply embedded in these products, and it's very hard for most of them to retrofit that, especially in an airplane that's mid-flight. For example, quite often this implies completely changing the way customizations are done. We all know e-commerce, is also a process technology, and it's customized to differentiate, at least for larger merchants. It's quite a differentiator to be able to have that flexibility. It turns out, the customization concept that is working well for single tenancy doesn't really work well for multi-tenancy, where you have a lot of shared resources across customers. You have to take care that you don't have noisy neighbors and other things. So that's a big thing. Then they need to move the whole thing into the cloud. Most of the vendors have done that by now. What they call it a PaaS or something, yeah. But it's literally still, hosting different versions that are not sort of like multi-tenant in many cases. So I would almost say it's managed hosting. Maybe that's a word that, of course, many of these vendors would want to not take in the mouth, but I'm doing it because that's probably more accurate. And then they still have to go and basically take the big monolith apart into smaller services. And all this at the same time, all this while still serving the needs of existing customers, having a implementation channel that's trained on certain things and so on. Very hard. I think you could do it probably if you had 5 years of time, on your own with your full team, just thinking it through. But in a space that is so quickly changing as e-commerce is, it's a very, very tough thing. And so that's basically been fueling, my hypothesis that the e-commerce technology landscape will change, and that there's new tech coming, new needs, new generations coming that are looking quite different to the ones that are out there, so far in the past. We've gone through many generations. I'm not going to explain all of them to you, but we're going to see, and we've heard that before from the previous speakers, we're going to see a focus much more on capabilities and features, but also looking at processes, business processes, because features and capabilities are not what customers want in the end. In the end, you have a business process, and that process needs to work start to finish. And I'll explain a little bit more in the following slide what that might look like. And so for that process, rather than having the suite, it needs to be composed. It's not taking an on-prem design and hosting it in the cloud, calling it cloud, and putting lipstick on a pig, but it actually has to build cloud native, which means it has to be microservice, it has to be multi-tenant, it has to scale elastically, it has to have a cloud native extension concept, all these type of things. And when you think about how to make it work with other components, that has to be assembled in the cloud, not necessarily pre-integrated. When you look at how customers are increasingly paying for this type of software. That's, by the way, something that's not just specific to e-commerce. It's very much driven by what is the value that I'm getting out of this? And that means typically also consumption-based pricing models are becoming more and more the norm here. So, massive changes about where literally the incumbents, many of the players, are not really working well. I once did, a mental exercise. I took the latest Forrester wave and I made a little tombstone on every vendor that I could find that does not meet those requirements. And honestly, I'm not going to tell you which ones, but there's not many left afterwards. Huh? That meant that many of these players, they will probably still be around for a couple of years, maybe a decade or longer, but probably they will not be the ones that have a massively growing market share. That's the opportunity for new disruptors coming in. And when you look at that, where do they come in? Well, here you can see it's like a typical model. You probably, maybe some of you've heard of this adoption model that's behind the book Crossing the Chasm. Basically, you see a Gaussian bell curve here, and you have on the left-hand side the innovators starting with new stuff first, and then early adopters, and then these are still small groups, and then it gets into an early majority and a late majority. That's where sort of like then most of the users have been using a new technology, and then maybe you have a few laggards, that folks that still don't use a smartphone in the year 2021. Maybe you'll find a few, but there's not that many anymore. And so this model is a fairly typical one, how technology percolates through a user base. And what we typically tend to see in e-commerce is business to consumer is the front runner for many things. Of course, because they have competitors like Amazon. And then they basically define the drumbeat of the industry. And so a lot of innovation towards headless, towards microservices, and now the other things I talked about has happened there. From an investor's perspective, $1.6 billion was invested as capital into not all startups, but also some larger companies, but companies that more broadly are aligned with these new paradigms. So that's a lot of money. That's probably way more so like capital than many of the incumbents have, for keeping their R&D departments going. So obviously, investors are very bullish on this, and certainly the pandemic has helped fuel that. On the other hand, what investors don't like, what I don't like personally, is if a market space becomes too crowded. That's almost like a red ocean. And I actually see that B2B commerce is a blue ocean. It's an underserved part of the market, because maybe B2B companies, not all of them, but in general, are lagging a little bit behind with the adoption of the latest and greatest technologies. But they are feeling the need to make no mistakes. They are being disrupted. Software is eating the world. They have new aggressive entrants coming in. They see platform players, entering their markets, and all these digital business models coming in. They see, the millennials as a new user base, exhibiting different buying patterns and going more digital, and so on. So that's clearly happening. But the market segment, from an e-commerce perspective, from an e-commerce tech perspective, I think is an underserved segment. And this is already a couple of years old, but I think maybe it's a good quote here from the chairman of Kraft Heinz. We all know the tomato ketchup from 2018, who says, "I am a terrified dinosaur." And that's probably maybe a good description of probably many companies in B2B. They lived in a cozy world, not much changing. You could focus on being very efficient and you'll be fine. And all of a sudden, whoops, there's a big disruption happening. And so I think that's what's, the smart guys are seeing it. Doesn't happen to everyone at the same pace, but, ultimately also a big part of e-commerce and B2B is happening. Typically what I've always seen, half roughly of my business always used to be B2B. But B2B is also much more complex. If we imagine what it would take to build an e-commerce platform, from the consumer side, I think we can all, guess pretty easily because we've all shopped online. We know what a cart does. You know what a promotion looks like. We know what a product detail page looks like and what a checkout flow looks like. We've all seen this. It's not that hard to build that as a product manager. In B2B, it is actually a completely different animal in many ways. And if we look at a typical customer journey here, it might be something like this. Yeah? So you now have to navigate a customer process across sort of like a swarm of these B2B capabilities or services. And it might start with you search for something, maybe you browse the catalog, but then maybe what you are interested in is more determined by your installed base. What other main products have you bought from the vendor before? What are the compatible add-ons or replacements or spare parts that work for this? Maybe there's a configuration needed because it's a complex piece of machinery. Then you put it in the cart, but maybe you also put service pieces and other elements in the cart, not just products that you can physically buy. Maybe there's a request for a quote because in B2B prices are being negotiated. Maybe there's a complex pricing engine involved. Maybe somebody on the CRM SFA side, as a person doing inside sales, picks it up, assembles a quote for you. Maybe it's a bit of a negotiation going back and forth. Maybe you accept the quote. Maybe it goes back into ERP system, updates, installed base, and other things. Maybe there's a setup service needed because it's not a trivial product. Somebody needs to come by your site, your factory, shop floor, and install the thing. And maybe a maintenance contract is sold with it as well. So just a simple example, your process might look different, but it shows you already that it's way more complicated than a shopping cart. And that's way more complicated than what you often see in the B2C space. That's maybe another explanation why it's an underserved market. And the other problem that I see that is unanswered by most vendors here is, well, somebody has to make it all work. If these colors represent different vendors, and the numbers, as we've seen before, of different vendors involved in your process is rather going up, not down. Well, that sounds like a lot of complexity to make that work, a lot of interfaces, a lot of integration work, and we probably don't just have one business process either. So I think that the new angle that the industry needs here is to actually think more in business processes and actually allow a customer to select, this is my business process, and then the options along the way. So I might use this e-commerce cart service. I might use that vendor for pricing. I might use this as my SFA and CRM tool, and this is my ERP system. And then you select that almost like in a drop-down form, and the whole process should be pre-assembled instantaneously, ideally, from different vendors. And then you start customizing and doing the extra, bells and whistles that really differentiate your business. That's, I think, the vision, how I see e-commerce going in the next 5 to 10 years going forward. And that's one of the key things that I'm super excited about. And that's really, to sum it all up, the reasons why we invested in Emporix. One, it's great timing. There's so many trends converging at this point in time where literally I see e-commerce in 5 years and 10 years looking very, very different from what we have today. I think the incumbents that are great companies that they've built, very successful with tons of great brands running on them, but they're not up for addressing that from their incentive structures and from sort of like their architectures holding them back. So and that's why you see sort of like some of the younger entrants look at just no further than Shopify, doing just fantastic. It's probably because there's not that many great alternatives from others there. Great people, I've worked with many of them. If you look to the team at Emporix, I think there's over a dozen people now from former Hybris, including 2 co-founders. So they know, they've built this before, they know sort of like what it takes to build e-commerce, for an enterprise grade level. And a product that really brings a lot of fresh ideas to an underserved part of the market, bringing the ability to assemble business processes along capabilities, and focusing on complex commerce scenarios. You'll find those in B2B, what I've just mentioned. You also find them in certain scenarios on the B2C side. Not everything is as trivial as selling or buying t-shirts online. So here we go, 3 very convincing reasons for me why we invested in Emporix. That's the end of my presentation.